Executing capital ship damage in Star Wars Squadrons is a little bit more difficult than some might think it actually is. What was once actually quite easy to pull off with rockets in interceptors like the A-Wing and the TIE Interceptor now requires a little bit of thinking before a game to actually execute proper capital ship damage. In higher tier games, the bomber isn't necessarily a capital ship or flagship damage dealer. They're mostly used for AI farming. And with the B-Wing mostly being used in lower tier gameplay rather than higher tier gameplay, it begs the question, what ship does the most capital ship damage effectively? As I mentioned before, I would use interceptors with the rockets. That was always the go-to because it was amazing to take out subsystems and take down frigates and raiders and all other ships that need to do capital ship damage, basically. So in today's video, we're going to be diving into what ships you can use and what loadouts that will do the best for capital ship damage to hopefully get you more wins in Star Wars Squadrons. But before we jump into it, guys, I've got to mention it. I've not mentioned it in a long time right now, but over 70% of you that watch our videos are not subscribed. So if you really enjoy our content and want to see more of Star Wars Squadrons, Star Wars fan games that we might put some attention to, and some other non-Star Wars content, definitely hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell because it'll definitely mean a lot to us. But with that all said and done, let's get right into the video. Alright, so let's break down what capital ship damage actually is. Capital ship damage, depending on what faction you're running, is what damage you deal to the raider or corvette, the frigate or the cruiser, or either of the flagships. This does not include ion damage, however. So if you're attacking the shields of whatever ship, you do not deal any form of capital ship damage. Whilst many of you probably already know this, it is quite important to note that this doesn't attribute anything to your score. And as we mentioned before, depending on how high up on the leaderboard you are compared to your allies, depends on how much skill rating you could lose or win depending on if you won or lost. So take that into consideration. But with the formalities out the way, let's look at some loadouts that can give you a lot of capital ship damage. So for the fighter class, we're running quite a few different builds here. This is also faction specific. So if you're playing the Empire, the loadout's going to be a little bit different compared to the New Republics. So for the X-Wing, I've got two builds here that are the most important to me. The first one, I'm running standard laser cannon, boost extension, iron torpedo, particle burst, standard hull, fortified deflector, and standard engines. This build is supposed to strip shields on cruisers as fast as possible. As soon as I've been deployed outside of the hangar of the MC-75, I'm building my shields up to 200% whilst also using boost extension to allow me to get to that Artisans as fast as possible. I need to get into about 1500 range, lock on, and then fire the ion torpedo at it. If your shot is successful, you completely strip the shields of that Artisans in one shot. Now, depending on if an enemy player shoots down your torpedo or maybe the Artisans does it itself, you need to go back, resupply, and retry again. But once the shields on both Artisans are down, there is no need for this build anymore. So only use this on the very early game. Once we're done with this build, we move on to the second one. This is the build that does a lot of capital ship damage. So here we're running standard laser cannon, proton torpedo, piercing torpedo, particle burst, reinforced hull, fortified deflector, and standard engine. This build is as tanky as we can be in an X-Wing. This is because this build has nothing to do with dogfighting at all. You're actually ignoring all the enemy players. All you need to focus on is getting in range of the Artisans and then firing both your proton and your piercing torpedo at it. And all you need to do after that is rinse and repeat. The reason we're running so tanky is if there happens to be a chance that the enemy targets you, you have enough shields and hull to survive it long enough to get to your side of the map. At the end of the day, it is absolutely vital you do not die during these games. So with proton torpedo and piercing torpedo, it allows you to deal capital ship damage from a distance. So if somebody does try to take you down in the process, you don't have to travel very far to be in safe grounds, whilst also having an absolute ton of health to survive any form of firepower. This is why I think X-Wings and TIE Fighters tend to do a better job at dealing capital ship damage than, say, bombers, because you're not having to risk getting so close to the Artisans or the Nebulon B to deal damage. Because once you're over on the enemy side, it can take a very long time to get to your end of the map. And for bombers not really having the speed or maneuverability, that can mean death. The reason I only have 2 builds for the X-Wing is because it is so easy to do subsystem damage as the New Republic. There is plenty of routes you can navigate in and around the Star Destroyer, which means you don't have to fire so many ion torpedoes to temporarily take down its shields. But let's move on to the Empire. Unfortunately, the Empire has a much harder time dealing capital ship damage than the New Republic. Whilst their firepower is higher than the New Republic's, it comes at the cost of a lot of survivability. You are so vulnerable that you have to give up one of your auxiliaries for supply droid just so you can keep alive. All my capital ship based TIE fighter builds all run reinforced hull, which gives us 2,480 total hull. However, for the X-Wing, running reinforced hull and fortified shields means we get a total of 2,880 health. And you can regen 960 of that because it's shields, which means the X-Wing is so much more survivable than the TIE fighter, which again makes capital ship damage runs a lot easier to do because you have a lot more survivability. But with that all said and done, let's go through the builds for the TIE fighter. For the early game, I'm running standard laser cannon, repair system, ion torpedo, particles, reinforced hull, and standard engines. This ion torpedo build does exactly the same as the ion torpedo build for the New Republic, so nothing new there. But of course, we are running repair system instead of boost extension kit because we need that survivability if we're fired upon. Once the shields on the Nebulon Bs are down, I run standard laser cannon, proton torpedo, piercing torpedo, particles, reinforced hull, and standard engine. This is because I can output as much damage to the Nebulon Bs as possible. Pretty much standard stuff, same as the New Republic. But when it comes to the MC-75, things change up a little. Because it is more difficult to get under the shields to fire on the shield generators, we kind of have to use multiple loadouts depending on the situation. So if my teammates are really struggling to take down the shield generators, I have a separate build where I'm running standard laser cannon, ion missile, piercing torpedo, particles, reinforced hull, and twin ion engine. The ion missile helps strip the shields off the MC-75 temporarily, and the piercing torpedo is used to fire upon the shield generators, bypassing the shields altogether. Unfortunately, this is a worst case scenario build. This is if my teammates are really struggling to get any form of capital ship damage done. But if things are looking a little bit more rosy and you can actually use proton torpedoes, I'll swap out the ion torpedo for a proton one instead. But again, proton torpedoes are useless if you're firing it on a shielded capital ship. Same goes for any other capital ship as well. Also, not forgetting raiders and corvettes. I would have loved to have seen some of these builds in the TIE Defender. The fact that it has shields makes it a really strong ship for the Empire, but unfortunately you can't really run anything like this on a TIE Defender. Ion missiles are quite nice to have, but they just don't get the job done when you're firing it on like a capital ship or a flagship. So this ship obviously remains as a dogfighter only. If you're not in the truly high tier of gameplay for Star Wars Squadrons, you can get away with using bombers. The reason bombers aren't as effective for dealing capital ship damage is because they're so easy to target and take down. Especially when their main damage dealers requires you to get really close to the capital ship. And sometimes that can make you a sitting duck for enemy players. I do highly recommend that you run proton bombs. Those do insane amounts of damage. And if you have a support player running supply droid, it means you can execute bombing runs more frequently on your attack phase. This is actually a method we used during the first Operation Ace esports tournament. Captain Shack was the bomber and I just kept resupplying him over and over again. But that was during a time where many people were still learning the game. But now, TIE bombers and Y-wings are so easily targetable that any mid to high tier player can just take them down in an instant. But for fighters, you can still run that tanky, be able to have more maneuverability and be able to do capital ship damage from afar, which bombers can't do. And the further you climb up the ladder, you start to realize that movement and mobility reigns above all. Why else do people find A-wings so infuriating to play against? It's because they're small, they're super fast, and their maneuverability is insane. But that pretty much concludes my loadouts that I use to get as much capital ship damage done as possible. For those of you who aren't exactly sure what angle I'm coming at here, I would say fighters do the best capital ship damage from raiders to capital ships to flagships. So if you're running a lot of bomber and you find that you're dying when you're trying to do bombing runs, I recommend trying out these loadouts as a fighter. But with that all said and done, I really hope all of this information is useful to you guys. It's really good to be back recording videos for you lot. But of course, I've been Charlie, you've been watching EcksToo, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.